We serve as an interface between the IRB board members and the researchers. We provide educational and support opportunities through our outreach and training efforts, such as webinars, in-person workshops, personal one-on-one meetings, just to name a few. We help researchers prepare for audits of their studies. Our staff will meet with researchers, review study documents and activities relating to their human research studies. We also provide education, monitoring, recommending best research practices, and providing solutions for areas of improvement. Since the IRB is committed to protecting the rights and welfare of subjects in human research, we also provide interpretations of research regulations and policies. An institutional review board is a university-wide standing committee responsible for reviewing and overseeing human research to ensure it is designed and conducted ethically and is responsible for ensuring the protection, safety, and welfare of study participants. The IRB board will review all research activities involving UTD-affiliated individuals. This includes research located on and off campus, studies done in collaboration with other universities, and studies that are funded and non-funded. So you might be wondering why an IRB is necessary for human research. Before the IRB was established, there were numerous research studies conducted a while ago that were considered unethical and inappropriate. One example that we're going to talk about today is the Tuskegee syphilis study. The United States Public Health Service conducted a study on the natural history of untreated syphilis from 1932 to 1972. Approximately 600 African-American rural men, about 400 with syphilis and 200 without, were recruited into the study without informed consent and were also misled into thinking that some of the experimental testing procedures were special free treatment for bad blood. The men were not told they had syphilis, nor were they told their ailment could be transmitted to their spouse and future children. They were promised many incentives, such as free medical examinations, hot meals, and free burial arrangements. By 1936, it had become clear that problems were more frequent in the infected men, and it was known that the death rate was twice as high in the men with syphilis. In 1947, penicillin was shown to be an effective treatment for syphilis, but the study continued and the subjects were not given penicillin or even informed about its availability. There were a lot of ethical dilemmas in this research study. The researchers did not act in the best interests of the participants. The risks outweighed the benefits. They failed to obtain informed consent. There was deception and false advertising. It was racially motivated. There were no rules and regulations governing the experiment, and there was a violation of participants' rights. So in 1972, which is 40 years after the study began, the press ran a story and the study was outed. Out of the 400 men with syphilis, 74 participants were still alive, 40 spouses had been infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The outrage resulted in the passage of the National Research Act, and the Institutional Review Board was established. In addition, the basic ethical principles were identified that researchers should adhere to when conducting human subject research. This became known as the Belmont Report. The first ethical principle is respect for persons. This is divided into two separate moral requirements: the requirement to acknowledge autonomy and the requirement to protect those with diminished autonomy. The second principle is beneficence. Researchers should minimize risk to participants and maximize benefits to participants in society. The third principle is justice. This addresses the distribution of the burdens and benefits of research. So the selection of participants should be directly related to the problem being studied. So the Office of Human Research Protections maintains the code of federal regulations that IRBs must follow. For example, the Common Rule defines the processes for IRB review and approval of research with human subjects. Other regulations listed are FDA regulations for protection of human participants investigational new drug applications, IRBs, and investigational device exemptions, just to name a few. Now my colleague Amanda will further discuss research and assessment.
But Tiffany she did a really good job of laying down who we are and giving a good understanding of what it is we do at the university here with the IRB office and the IRB committee, and also why it is that we're here and why it's even necessary to have an IRB office in existence. So what I want to do is continue and kind of touch upon the difference between research and academic assessment. When is a project something that you need to, when you're thinking about doing it and planning doing it, when do you need to contact the IRB office and get us involved in the process? So the first thing we should do is look at research and look at what it is that we're actually talking about. So the IRB is interested in looking at research projects that involve human subjects, and research is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to the generalized knowledge. And anytime you look at regulations, this is what you'll see, and it is just a widely used definition. But what does this actually mean? So there are two components that I wanted to break down even further, and that is the systematic investigation and generalized knowledge. So these are the two components of the definition of research. So first, what's a systematic investigation? It is a careful investigation, examination, and the important thing is prospectively identified processes, methods, plans, systems in place. So before you ever start out to collect that data, you have a plan in place. You have a method, you have a system of how you're going to collect it, analyze it, all of this stuff. So that is the systematic investigation. It is prospective. And when we're looking at generalized knowledge, which is that second part of that research definition, it is getting the information, the results of that study, of that examination that you had, and getting that into the larger audience. So you want to publish that. And what I say, I highly stress the publishing part of this, but it doesn't incorporate just publishing. So if I want to do a study and then put it out for the scientific community or maybe my professional community, I want to publish a paper, or maybe I want to go to a conference and do a talk at a conference or a poster presentation, or just talk with my colleagues while I'm out. So I'm going to go back to that research slide. So we have the systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to the generalized knowledge. And so you have that prospective idea and that plan in place, and that expectation up front that you will actually publish and get that out there into the public. So the purpose of research is as I've mentioned, is to generate that new knowledge. You're testing a hypothesis. You have a research question, and you want to really come up with the answer to that question. You have a hypothesis, and you want to test that. And the audience, of course, is the larger scientific professional community. And publication is really key to getting that out there, to getting that to the benefit of the larger audience. So that's research, and the IRB doesn't look at all research projects. What we're really looking at is human subjects, when human subjects are involved. And a human subject is a living individual. So if somebody was looking at doing research on cadavers, that's not human subjects research. We're interested in the living individual that data was collected from and then used in research in some way. So there are a few different ways that you can collect research from individuals. The first two are really kind of what most people think about when they think about intervention, or when they think about collecting data from people. And that is like the intervention. When you're talking about like medical research, a lot of this comes into play when you're doing some sort of physical procedure on an individual, but there's also the manipulation of the environment or the person. And so at UT Dallas, we don't do medical research, but we do the manipulations of the environment. So if I want to run people through an MRI machine and present them with different stimuli and study what's going on in their brain while we're doing that, that's an intervention. Or if I want to give an individual different types of learning materials to see how they might respond to those, what actually helps reading comprehension, those types of things. That is an intervention. Also, there's the interaction, and that's just the communication or interpersonal. So that could be a survey, that could be a interview face-to-face, or those types of things where we're actually communicating and we're looking at. It can also be observation, where we're communicating with them and we're observing what's going on as we're communicating and we're in contact with that individual. And then there's also the private information, which I think is not thought of as much, but it is the information that was collected for a purpose, and it was anticipated. The participant had a reasonable expectation that that data would not be made public, that it would be private information. And an example of that might be medical information. I give my doctor all kinds of information about myself, my demographics, my history, all of that stuff. And that my expectation is that that data will be used for medical purposes. So if a researcher wanted to then use that data that was collected for medical purposes in a research study, then that would be a human subjects study. The same would be for student data. A student is giving their data to the institution, to the university, for the purposes of helping them get the services as a student. And that's the education and the services that the university provides. And so if they don't have the expectation that then their data would be used and results would then be published in some sort of public way. And it's the same for samples. So like if I had a tumor removed and a doctor was then sent it to an investigator and some sort of study was done on like a tumor or saliva samples or blood, something like that, that also fits into this public information that we sometimes call archival data. So let's talk about an example of a research question. So the research question itself, the investigator wants to look at flipped college classrooms and see if how they compare to traditional lectures or the lecture and lecture review. And this is groundbreaking research, I realize, but this is their question. And so we have several different things here. The design, let's talk about the design. So it'll be like quasi-experimental, where you compare 3 different classrooms, the same subject, 3 different classrooms. Each classroom, they're going to have a different approach. The first one is going to be the traditional lecture, and that's all it is. The second one is going to be that lecture, and then a lecture capture backup, so that the student could come to the lecture and then access that podcast at home or whenever they wanted, or just to kind of refresh. And then the third classroom would have that flipped classroom approach with innovative classroom activities. It's got blended learning, student engagement, just a more personalized, less didactic type of environment. So that's the design. The procedures is you're going to have a pre-test at the very beginning for each class, a 16 weeks of instruction, and then you'll have the post-test. And the data analysis is you're comparing the students' pre-test. You're comparing the students from the classes, the post-test performance, and then you're looking at the changes between the pre and the post-test between each of the 3 different classes. And the use of the results, the intent at the very beginning was to share this with the community at large, because you really do think that you're going to have something that's really cool that you want to then push out to help other institutions and other universities and how they are teaching their students across the country. We're talking about academic assessment. Here's a big, long definition. For the most part, it is establishing, you have this established, measurable expected outcome of student learning. You're going to give the students the resources that they need to be successful, to achieve those outcomes. You're going to then take the data, you're going to have a system in place where you're taking that data, you're measuring that data and analyzing it to kind of see how well the students were doing. We're going to interpret the evidence of student learning and see how that matches up with the expectations from the beginning of the class. And then what you're going to do is use the resulting information to understand and improve student learning. So the purpose of academic assessment is to improve student learning or student satisfaction. So you want to improve the services that you're giving that student. You want to make sure that not only do you have a program that's successful with student learning, but you also want them to be satisfied with that as well so that they enjoy taking the course. And what you're focusing really on is program accountability and management of that program. So that's what you're looking at. And the audience is going to be those institutional stakeholders. It's going to be the faculty, the staff, the student, UT Dallas leadership, the president, the provost, all of those individuals. UT System can also be an institutional stakeholder in UT Dallas instruction, because they really are interested in how each institution in the UT system, how they're doing with student learning and evaluating that as well and keeping up with that. And then the state of Texas. We are a state institution, and they really do keep tabs on how education is going throughout the state of Texas and at each institution. So they are also an institutional stakeholder. So there are studies that, or there are projects that you guys are doing with student assessment, academic assessment. And is there any information that you can share where it doesn't cross over into research? And absolutely, there is information that you can share. You can go to conferences and share information. You can share information about the program and the program processes. There's no student data involved in that. It's just, this is the program that we have, that we've implemented, and these are the processes of that program. Absolutely fine to share. There's also university facts and statistics, which is fine as well. This is the information that could be on our website potentially. If I wanted to go to a conference and talk and then say, we have, such and such percentage of our population is underrepresented students. Completely fine. Student quotes. If there are students who love your program and what you've done and you want to share that, these students are supporting that. Whether if you use their name, please get their permission. It's not IRB. It's not human subjects research. But you can also do it where you don't use their name and it's an anonymous quote. The student said this. You can also share surveys, rubrics, and assessments that don't contain student data. So here's the survey that we used. Here's the assessment process and what we were using for the assessment. Completely fine to share. It does not cross over into research. That still stays in the lane of the academic assessment. So let's talk about an example of academic assessment. So the course objective, the expectation up front, is students are going to analyze research on social problems, and they're going to come up with solutions that can be used in the real world. Why it is that you're kind of looking at and analyzing and you want to see how students are doing is because in the past, it kind of seems like students are having a hard time developing cohesive and well-supported explanations about how they would actually solve these social issues and problems. And so you want to see okay, how can we improve and how can we make this better? You're thinking maybe the flipped classroom is the way to go, but you're not really sure. So the purpose of the analysis is to assess student performance when you're using different methods. So the design is quasi-experimental design. You're going to compare two class sections of the same course using flipped classroom in one, and you're going to use the current section in the second. You're going to compare rubric ratings for the first and last paper, assignment grades, overall course grades. That's the data analysis. And the use of results is you're going to share with UTD faculty and leadership and staff. And the purpose of that is to determine whether or not to keep or expand the flipped classroom approach and whether or not changes to instruction are needed. Do we want to implement this across campus? Or, even if it's just, hey, within our school, do we want to implement this even within our school or our program? How do we want to make changes to better student learning? Now, there are some studies that start out as academic assessment. And you start out, you don't have any expectation that you're going to publish at all. You're not intending to write a paper. You're not intending to go to a conference and talk about your results, but you're getting into it and there's some really fascinating things that you're finding out. And now, I want to do research. Contact the IRB office is what I would say. Contact the IRB office, stop the analysis for now and contact the IRB office because you're starting to creep into the research realm. So if you start with the assessment and it kind of goes into the research where I want to publish, that's kind of the trigger point for that. And that does happen. So now we've talked about research versus assessment. You know that you have a research project, you're working with student data. Okay, let's talk about the IRB process itself. I'm going to contact you guys. So the timing of approval, you have the retrospective versus the prospective approval. So retrospective is kind of what I was talking about, where you're doing your assessment and, oh my gosh, this would be a fabulous research project. I would really want to share this outside the UTD community. This is retrospective. You've already collected that data, you have that data, and now you need to get IRB approval to actually do your research study. It can also work when you are getting records from, say, the registrar, or you're getting records that were already collected from another investigator, another faculty member, for purposes of their instruction, but you want to access that. That would also be retrospective. Prospective is when you start your project and you know this is going to be your research and I'm going to publish this. When you know that, that's prospective. And the main difference between the two is the consent. So the one thing that we talked about was respect. That is one of the Belmont Report principles. And when we're talking about the prospective, that's the main difference, is just that consent and how to get that consent from the individuals, from the students. When you're using student records, this kind of ties into that. When you're using the student records, it's really important to get their permission if you can. With those retrospective ones, sometimes you just can't, because maybe you collected data a couple years ago and now you want to use it and all the students are gone. That type of thing. When the IRB is going to look at that and each study individually and make the determination what makes the most sense. If this is a retrospective study, it's a good idea to go ahead and ask for that waiver of documentation of consent. So that means you're not contacting each student. And it seems the IRB wouldn't expect you to do that. For the institutional approvals, I'm sorry, for going back to the student permission, if it is something that the students, it's a prospective study, and you have those students, it's good to let them know that their data could be used for research, whether that be a statement in the syllabus or whether that be an actual documentation of consent. And the IRB is going to make that determination depending on the type of data that you're using, the type of analysis, and the type of stuff that you want to publish. They're looking at the risk involved and that type of thing. So it could just simply be language in a syllabus to let them know that this data will be used for research, or it could be an actual consent form where you're documenting. We also have institutional approvals. It's really important to have permission, the appropriate permissions. So if I'm contacting, if I want to get data from the registrar, make sure you're not just getting data from Jane Doe that works at the registrar, that you're actually getting the permission from the appropriate person or the designee of that person that has permission, that has the ability and the authority to give that permission of use of the data. It's important to know that at UT Dallas, students are considered vulnerable population. And this slide really does kind of showcase some of the things that could happen with students. You see a student, and pretty much everybody at the university the student looks at as a potential authority figure. So when we're talking about the principle of respect and the Belmont principles, it really is the ability of a person. They are the best person to determine whether or not they want to be in a research study. If they're given the information in a way that they can understand and they're told the truth about it, and they have the ability to make that determination on their own. And it should, when you introduce things like power dynamics and all of that stuff, you kind of get into muddled water where, you know, we don't want it to be where the student doesn't feel like they can say no. They should be able to say no and know that their grades or the quality of their education will not be affected adversely. It's also important to know that when offering extra credit, if that is something that is going to be offered, it's important to have an alternative assignment. Something that they can say, no, I don't want to do this research project, but they're not going to be penalized for that and not afforded the same opportunity for extra credit as people who are engaging in that research opportunity. And make sure that the extra credit that you're giving isn't so large that if I have to say yes, regardless of whether I want to or not, because I can't miss up an opportunity that, because 10% would pull me up into an A or, something like that. So you want to make sure that the incentive isn't so large that it would make people kind of not pay attention to the risks that are involved. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tiffany, and she's going to bring us home.
All right, so now there may come a time when you think your research needs to go through IRB review. So how do you get started? First, as Amanda mentioned before, contact our office before conducting any research activities. Our staff can help guide you on the IRB process once we know more information about your research. So as you can see, sometimes between assessment and research, it might be a little bit of a gray area. So if our staff knows what you're trying to do and what you're trying to research, you may or may not need to go through the IRB process. And that's something that we can definitely help you with. Our staff can also guide you on the IRB process. An application packet should be complete and submitted as a whole. The application should also be written in plain, easily understandable language. And the application should also be submitted through an electronic portal. The estimated submission to approval time for full board review is 4 to 6 weeks. And this is where the entire institutional review board will review and decide on approval for studies that are greater than minimal risk and may include vulnerable populations. For expedited review applications, the process is about 2 weeks. And this type of research is no more than minimal risk. And the minimal review application is around 1 week, and this type of research is less than minimal risk. Please keep in mind that the time frame may vary depending on the potential application revisions before we actually submit it to the IRB for review. While you are filling out the IRB application, our office will need to know the following: a description of the study. So who are the participants that you're going to include in your study? What are you going to have them do, or what are you looking at? When do you plan on doing your research? Where do you plan on doing it? Why are you doing it, and how? Also, a description of how and where the data is collected, stored, and transferred. So will the data be in electronic format, in hard copy, or both? How will you interact with participants? So we will need recruitment scripts of what you will say to potential participants about your study, what's going to be expected of the participants, and how long will the study take. Also including any study procedures that you plan on doing in your study, and a copy of the consent form that you'll use. We also need justification for collection of sensitive data or enrollment of vulnerable participants, if that's what your study is going to be looking at. Also, how you obtain the consent from participants. So will you be doing a verbal consent? Will it be online consent? There's a couple different ways you can consent them. Just also remember that written consent information should be provided to each participant so they have a copy of it. Who has access to the data? All study personnel on the study should complete the human subjects protection training and provide certificates with the application. So this is the Human Subjects Protection Training Certificate that needs to be completed. You can access it by going to UTD e-learning and logging in with your UTD credentials. You go to My Organizations, and as you can see on the picture on the right, it's going to be at the bottom. You click on Human Subjects Protection and complete the course module. You take and pass the quiz. You need to score at least a 27 to pass the quiz. You are able to retake the quiz as often as you need in order to pass. And once you pass, you save your HSP certificate and attach it to the IRB application when you submit the materials to us. Contact information for the IRB office is provided on this slide. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions or concerns. And that concludes our webinar presentation. We will now be available for any questions you may have. Thank you for your interest.